You found it where? That was my reaction when my team leader came into the operations room and told us that they found one of the staircases in the middle of a forest. This was the first occurrence of it manifesting outside the facility, and it caused both confusion and worry for us in the exploration team. For the past few months, the organization had been experimenting in interdimensional travel, but not in the way that you would expect. Instead of opening up wormholes and using portals, they used a method that seemed strange and laughable to us at first. Staircases. Yes, that's right, plain old wooden staircases. I won't go into the exact science behind it because even I don't really understand how it works. It's complicated, extremely complicated. One glimpse at these squints boards and walls were enough to tell me that it was all beyond my understanding. Not that that's saying much, since most of us in the exploration team are pretty down on the scale, since they only require people who are healthy, could carry the necessary equipment, and can follow instructions. Anyways, all I know is that whenever the scientist activates some kind of ancient machine and manifests a staircase with a set of 10 steps that seemingly leads to nowhere. However, despite its rather simple and innocent sight, it was actually a gateway to a room in another dimension. From the bottom of the staircase, it was hard to tell where it would lead you. Going up the first few steps didn't change much and you would still see nothing. But once you get to that last step, you're taken to a whole new dimension. What extra-dimensional room the staircase would lead to was always a mystery. It was different every time a staircase was conjured up, and no two staircases ever led to the same place. The only consistent thing was that it led to a room, sometimes extremely large and sometimes extremely small, but always a room with no exit. Other than that, nothing was certain. Was it going to be safe? Would it be inhabited? Would it be useful for humanity? These were questions these scientists would ask every time they spawned a staircase. It was up to the exploration team to find the answers for them. Now I know what you're thinking. Why not send a drone or a robot in there? Wouldn't they do the same job without risking human lives? Well, it turns out that interdimensional hopping is not friendly with such technologies. For some reason that I, as well as these science boys, do not know why yet. Anything digital just gets fried when crossing dimensions. And that's why unmanned options were quickly rolled out and why we in the exploration teams had to use analog equipment. Recruited from those people who would not be missed or were crazy enough to abandon everything and go head first into danger. We in the exploration team were essentially guinea pigs that were paid considerably for their role in science. Personally, I like to think of myself as belonging to the latter group. But let's face it, I'm more of the former. No significant other, no more living family that I'm close with, not even a dog. I was a nobody. But at least I was a rich nobody. I just gotta make sure that I lived long enough to be able to spend the wealth that I was accumulating. And luckily for me and everybody on the team, most of the dimensions that we had explored had been largely harmless. Creepy, but harmless. From an empty room with nothing but pitch black darkness to a humongous one that was filled with mountains of bones and rather passive of floating eyes. And the places we explored were enough to give anyone nightmares. That's probably why we had to go through constant psych evaluations before and after each exploration. However, as interesting these strange and terrifying dimensions were, they were not what our organization wanted. After all, the goal of the organization was to find a dimension that would greatly benefit humanity. At least that's what they told us. Talk in the mess room, though, says that it was more on finding a dimension that could bring a large profit for the top dogs who run the organization. Personally, I don't care, as long as they keep on giving me my paycheck. With all the previous dimensions giving nothing that satisfied the organization's demands, the scientists were under constant pressure to find one that would bring in the money. This pressure on them was all too evident to us in the exploration team, as our old pace of exploring 2 staircases a week soon shifted to 14 staircases a week. It quickly became tough for us to work, as we found ourselves constantly in demand. If we were lucky, we would get a small room that only required one member of the team looking around for a few minutes, but we were never lucky. Ever since the science team started working on overdrive, the rooms that we got were mostly the big ones. Not only that, but they seemed to get constantly bigger with each new staircase conjured up, often taking the full team hours to explore. These rooms were time-consuming and exhausting. To make matters worse, once we were done, we often walked down the stairs empty-handed. It was clear that the bigger rooms were just as devoid of anything useful or profitable as the smaller ones. After nearly 3 weeks of this, morale was low for everyone. We did, however, catch a day's break when we were told that the science team were going to work to adjust the ancient machinery in order to get better results. This breakthrough didn't last though, because that was the same day that a staircase manifested in the middle of the forest. The tech boys were messing around with their machine when it suddenly activated on its own. Our team leader Jonathan said after giving us the shocking news. Strangely though, nothing appeared. They checked and swept the testing floor but found no new staircases. They then checked the rest of the facility and still found nothing. With no luck, they then had to ask the security team to send out vehicles and choppers to scan the nearby area. They eventually found the thing in the middle of a forest 20 miles from here. 20 miles, I said. I didn't know it was possible for them to spawn that far from the machine. Yeah, well, after all the tinkering the tech boys have done, I think anything is possible with that toy of theirs at this point, Jonathan huffed. Yeah, anything except find the dimension that the higher-ups want, I remarked. So what happens now then? Rachel, one of the newest members of the team, had asked. They want us to explore it, Jonathan simply said. No use in wasting a good set of staircases, I guess. Henry, an explorer who had joined the same time as me, sighed. You know it, Jonathan said. Alright, I want section 2 on this. I winced when I heard this. That was my section. We head out in 10 minutes, so be there at the transport bay with all your gear and equipment, Jonathan informed us. The sooner we get there and get this done, the sooner we get back. And who knows, we might get lucky and get a small one. As if. Charlie, the most senior member of Section 2, replied. We haven't had a small room for so long that I'm starting to forget what they look like. Small. Christine, the leader of our section, plainly replied. Just like you. Oh, shut up, Charlie groaned, as all of us in Section 2 got up and got ready for the sudden mission. An hour later, we were at the outpost the security and science team had set up near the rogue staircase. Looking around the little camp they made, I couldn't help but find it all too familiar. Aside from the dirt and trees, all the equipment set up around the staircase made it feel similar to the setup that they had back at the facility. For a second, this made me think that everything was going to be routine as always. After being briefed by the science team and gearing up, we were quickly lined up at the bottom of the staircase with Jonathan at the lead. He had the habit of wanting to be the first one to cross in any mission that he was involved in. I guess he felt that the leader of the exploration team must always be ready to lead from the front whenever the opportunity arose. Check your suits and double-check them, he told us as he gazed up at the stairs. You never know what could be out there waiting for us. He didn't need to tell me twice. I was already busy scrutinizing every inch of my hazmat suit before the words left his mouth. Since the rooms we entered were never meant for humanity to step foot on, many of them contained various hazardous elements that we needed to protect ourselves from. Thus, all of us on the team were equipped with the best hazmat suits the organization had. As we finished checking our suits, Jonathan began moving down the line to double-check our suits himself, as well as tugging on our safety harness and lanyard. Protocol demanded that anybody crossing dimensions must be secured by a safety harness tethered to a mechanism that was ready to pull us back to safety. Although it gave us some reassurance that we would be rescued from danger when needed, its true purpose was to recover the valuable data and samples that we gathered. Through the use of various equipment ranging from VHS cameras, Geiger counters, range-finding equipment, and sample collection tools, every section that entered a room was well equipped to attain all the information that the eggheads needed. To their dismay though, we couldn't transfer the data as fast as they wanted to, and there was always the risk of it being lost if we encountered trouble. Ideally, we would have transmitted the information the moment that we got them, since the eggheads often got anxious waiting and it lessened the chance of losing data if we didn't make it back. However, for whatever reason, radio and phone cable communication between two dimensions doesn't work. This thus left us with no other choice but to write down the data and place them in a canister, before tossing it back to the other side. Now, this was easy for the smaller rooms, but nearly impossible for the larger ones. And that's why we often just noted down the readings that we got so that in the event that we were incapacitated or worse, they could just reel us back in with our notes and samples. Once our suits and equipment were checked multiple times, Jonathan returned to his position at the head of the line and gestured to the lead scientist that we were ready to enter. Once he had received confirmation, he looked back at us and gestured towards the staircase. "I'll go in first to check the situation on the other side. With any luck, this would just be a small room," he said before taking the first step. "Hopefully not too small," I heard the muffled voice of Charlie say behind me. I couldn't help but nod at this. The story of one member from a different section entering a room that was only 1 foot by 1 foot in size was a story familiar to everyone in the team. Like I said earlier, the rooms are mostly harmless, but not completely. Every once in a while, a section would encounter a dangerous room that would bring on casualties. As I stood there, I prayed that what we were about to encounter was not one of them. But I didn't want to bring my hopes up. It had been a good while since a dangerous room had been encountered. Add that to the fact that this staircase was far from normal, then the chance of its room being equally far from normal were high. Shaking my mind away from these thoughts, I returned my focus back to reality and looked towards Jonathan, who was already going up the staircase, halting at the second to last step. Jonathan paused for a few seconds to check the compact camcorder that he was carrying. After making sure that it was on, he cautiously took the final step and soon vanished from our sight. All of us knew that he was now on the other side as we held our breaths and anxiously waited for his return. If he didn't come back within 5 minutes, the emergency recovery system would be activated, and he would be yanked back to our dimension. To our relief though, we saw him come back down to the second to the last step after only 2 minutes. Bad news, everyone. The room is huge. Other than that though, it seems pretty safe. All readings are normal and there are no beings or anomalies wandering nearby. He informed us before pausing to think. I couldn't see the walls from where I stood, but my estimates say that it's a class 5 or more. That last remark was for both us and the science team. A class 5 room meant that we had at least 5 hours to explore the place and gather data before the recovery team would begin pulling us back if we did not return. Alright then, Christine, who was now heading up the stairs, said, "Let's check this place out and hopefully find something interesting." Personally, I would rather find nothing than something interesting, but I followed close behind her with the same enthusiasm as the rest of the section. As Christine approached the top, Jonathan turned back and crossed dimensions again. Following close behind was Christine, camcorder already in hand, and soon enough, she too disappeared, leaving me to follow next. Making sure that my own camcorder was on, I made my final step in our dimension and crossed to the other side. What I saw was not what I expected. Instead of seeing a large room with Jonathan and Christine waiting for me, I saw a set of stairs leading downwards towards a small clearing in a dark forest. At first, I thought that I somehow got disoriented and I was looking back down the staircase, but that didn't make sense because there was nobody else there. No members of my section, no members of the science, recovery, and security team. No one. This was not the same place. In fact, it wasn't even the same time of day. When I made the crossing, it was clearly daytime, and over here though, it was night. This was strange. No, it was beyond strange. Encountering a room that looked like a forest wasn't anything new. Many sections have seen some of the rooms before. But to have the vanguard of the section disappear without a trace, now that was something that I'm not sure had happened before. Sighing, I lifted my camcorder and began to film my surroundings. Meanwhile, I kept my head on a swivel, using the flashlight of my suit's hood to light up the nearby trees. "Jonathan! Christine!" I called out, hoping to hear a reply. But there was no response and I could see no sign of anybody nearby. At that point, I realized that the place must not have been as safe as Jonathan had originally thought. If the two of them were missing, then it could mean that something in the environment or something lurking in this area could have eradicated or taken them. Feeling the fear rising within me, I dropped the camcorder and allowed it to dangle from its cord. With my now free hand, I quickly grabbed my Geiger counter, turned it on, and began using the probe to scan the area around me. To my relief, though, the readings only read 0.20 microsieverts per hour. That was a normal amount for background radiation. However, this data did little to completely ease my fear, and there was still the question of what happened to my team leader and section leader. Cautiously, I scanned my surroundings again, trying to see if there was anything lurking there and waiting to pounce on me, but I found none. So I was left there, standing all alone, wondering what had happened to the two of them. It was at that moment of wondering that another realization hit me. Why was I alone here? Concerned, I decided to look behind me, hoping to see the other members of my section walk in. They should have already crossed, but maybe there was a delay on the other side that I didn't notice when I jumped in. As these seconds passed, though, not a single one appeared. As these seconds turned into minutes with still no sight of them, I knew that they were not arriving. This was not right. They should be close behind me. Something terribly wrong was happening. Trying my best to keep calm, I tried to think on how I should proceed next. However, as I was thinking, my eyes fell on a bone-chilling sight. Crouching down, I grabbed my lanyard and lifted it up to my eyes. Seeing it up close only confirmed what I already caught a glimpse of. It had been cut. Studying it in complete shock, I saw a neat, clean cut on it. Not a tear, but a straight cut, as if somebody had used a knife. If it was a knife, though, then it must have been an extremely strong knife to be able to cut through the lanyard that the organization used. Whatever the reason for it being cut, one thing was clear. My only connection to my dimension had been severed. This was bad. I needed to get back. Protocol demanded that any loss of connection with the home dimension necessitated an immediate return. With that in mind, I dropped the lanyard and began feeling for the exit that should take me back. In my panic, I rushed towards the direction that I came from, expecting that I would immediately be taken back to my dimension. However, to my complete horror, instead of phasing through and reappearing back home, I instead fell from the top of the stairs that I was standing on, and I landed on the hard ground below. Landing on my left arm, I lay there stunned and in pain. I was sure that I had broken my arm from that fall, and the aching sensation it gave was terrible. Eventually, though, I managed to gather my strength and roll myself so that I would be facing upward. As I did so, I noticed what was staring down at me. It wasn't a ceiling like I had seen in so many rooms. Instead, it was an open night sky. Looking at it with disbelief, I felt that my eyes were betraying me. Never before has any exploration team encountered anything but a room. For a second, this made me speculate that what I was seeing wasn't the real night sky. Perhaps the room was just really tall and that I just couldn't see the ceiling. After all, we had encountered such rooms before. Then again, I don't think we ever found a room that had stars twinkling in its artificial sky. No, this wasn't a room. This was a real open space. I had never encountered something like that before. I don't think anyone in the exploration team has. The place just kept on getting stranger and stranger with each passing second. Managing to get up, I started to assess my injury and realized that I had broken a bone during the fall. Feeling the pain from the injury and knowing that I had to apply first aid, I cautiously looked for anything that I could use to make a splint. Finding a large twig, I began making the splint with it and bandages for my first aid kit. It hurt a lot, but I tried to control myself from making too much noise, or else attract any entities or creatures that may be lurking nearby. After all, I still wasn't sure if this place was fully safe. Once I was sure that the splint was good, I turned back towards the staircase and wondered if I was indeed trapped here. Moving back up the stairs, I halted at the last step and waved my good arm in front of me. Nothing. As an extra measure, I repeated the process, desperately praying that my hand would disappear. But it did not. There was no way back home. Sighing, I sat on the step, feeling defeated. It was at that moment when I noticed something odd about the trees. They had moved. I only caught a glimpse of it, but I was sure that they had moved. Locking my eyes on the closest tree, I watched them swing left and right, but there was no breeze. No, it wasn't the wind that made it do that. it was because it moved. Keeping my focus on them, I waited for it to do it again, but nothing happened. As if they were taunting me and making me question what I saw, the tree stayed still. However, just as I was about to give up, I saw it happen again. Right in front of me, the trees began to shift from where they were and move a good 30 feet. Without lifting themselves out of the ground, they pushed their way through the ground before halting and staying in place once more. Observing this a few more times, I realized that they seemed to be doing this every 15 minutes. Why they were doing it, I wasn't sure, but it certainly wasn't the weirdest thing that I've encountered when compared to past dimensions. It also didn't seem like a danger to me. It was just strange, just like any other dimension. So what had happened to Jonathan and Christine then? There must have been some other anomaly or entity hiding here. Wondering what my next move should be, I contemplated whether I should stay there and wait for rescue or if I should explore the surrounding area and find a way to save myself. After weighing the options, I eventually decided to go look around. The chance of somebody from my dimension coming to rescue me was slim to none. After all, we explorers were expendable and the organization was not going to expend resources trying to recover me or whatever data I may hold if the dimension that I was in was this dangerous. There was no profit in dangerous dimensions. It would only cost more for them. With that dreary thought in mind, I got up from the steps, went back to the forest floor and began moving away from the staircase in order to explore this strange new place. There wasn't much to see though, even as I drifted farther and deeper into the forest. Everywhere that I looked was just more and more trees, doing their strange dance every 15 minutes. Aside from that, the land was empty and flat, with no landmarks or anything of interest. For half an hour, I found myself wandering around and wondering if I was moving at all, as the whole place looked the same no matter where I went. It was just rows upon rows of moving trees. However, as I continued in my search, I eventually noticed that the grouping of the trees started to become denser. From the average of 30 feet near the staircase, it lessened to 20 feet. And as I went on, it soon lessened to 10 feet, as the forest around me started to feel more crowded. Curious by this, I began to follow the dense clustering of trees. It was clear they were converging towards something. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. Nestled in between a circle of trees was one tree. At first, it looked plain and similar to all the other trees. However, after a few minutes passed by, the tree began to shake violently. Rocking in all directions, I first thought that it was about to fall. To my amazement though, the tree remained rooted up, and instead shook out of it 8 similar trees, which began to move outward from it. Meanwhile, all the other trees surrounding them began to move outward too, as they shifted and made room for the newly created ones. The trees, perhaps all of the trees in the forest, came from that single tree. They were multiplying from it. They were all clones of that one tree. Sadly for me, it was of little help towards my situation. Sighing, I took a moment to sit down, being sure not to place myself in the path the trees moved through. Allowing myself a moment's rest, I let out a groan of both frustration and pain, feeling both my mental and physical state aching. A quick break from exploring is something that I clearly needed at that moment. However, before I could relax myself and clear my mind, a series of ear-piercing crackles suddenly echoed. These crackles then began to increase with each second until it reached a point that it was practically shrieking. It took me a second to realize that it was my Geiger counter going crazy. Worried by the sounds that it was making, I grabbed the device and brought it to my face to read the data that it was giving me. What I saw made my eyes grow wide. 1 million microsieverts per hour. Yeah, that was bad, extremely bad. I needed to get out of there. Prolonged exposure to that level of radiation would be fatal for me. Thus I wasted not a second more towards figuring out what could have caused the sudden spike in radiation, as my instincts quickly kicked in. Suddenly filled with adrenaline, I got myself up and began moving. It started off as a fast walk, but I soon quickened my pace until I found myself running. I didn't know where exactly I was running to, but I prayed that it was somewhere that had less radiation in the environment. Encountering the first bit of luck I had since arriving in the dimension, I was relieved when I glanced at the counter and saw the reading had lowered down to 500,000 per second. At least that told me that I was heading away from the source of the radiation. A little further down, I checked the device again and saw that the reading had lowered down to 100,000 microsieverts per hour. A minute later, and another check read 1,000 microsieverts per hour. This was good and much safer, but I decided to continue on further until the background radiation had dropped to 0.2 microsieverts per hour. Once I was sure that I was in safe ground, I allowed myself to catch my breath. Checking my surroundings as I did so, I saw that I was now in an area where the trees were more loose and far apart. But just like in any other portion of the forest, the trees seemed never-ending and there was no sign of the edge. Sighing, I stumped on the ground, feeling frustrated. There seemed to be no escaping this forest and there seemed to be no escaping this dimension. Not wanting my mind to further wander towards depressing thoughts, I decided to look around once more in order to get my bearings. If anything, that would at least distract me from my own pessimism. With nothing helpful for me in the forest, I decided that it was best to return to the staircase and hope that the link back towards my dimension had returned. However, as I was trying to figure out that path back there, my Geiger counter started to act up again. Checking it, I was surprised to see that it was moving back towards 1,000 per hour. At first, I thought it meant that I ended up at another source of radiation. However, as I watched it rise to 100,000 microsieverts per hour, it dawned upon me that the source was not a stationary location, but it was moving and approaching me. That would explain why my Geiger counter only started going crazy after I sat down earlier, and not while I was approaching the area. It wasn't a place that was radioactive. It was some sort of mobile entity. Looking back towards where I had come from, I stared on with fear, wondering what kind of entity could be emitting such high levels of radiation. Not too keen on finding out, I began moving once more. The only good thing I thought at the time was that I seemed to be faster than the radiation-carrying entity. Despite this, I knew that there was still the possibility that it had better endurance than me. With my injury, I could only go so far before the pain would force me to stop, even with adrenaline still pumping in my veins. While I ran, I made sure to monitor the Geiger counter to ensure that its readings lowered as I got farther. As long as I kept it to 1,000 microsieverts per hour and below, I knew that I would be safe. To my dismay, though, that number held firm at around 100,000, telling me that it was keeping up pace with me. So much for being able to outrun it. And despite my best attempts to move faster, I found my efforts fruitless. As the Geiger counter started to shriek, it was gaining speed and it was getting closer. Daring myself to look behind me, I noticed a faint green glow emitting in the distance. Hidden by the trees, I couldn't quite see what was making that glow, but I did know that seeing its light meant that it was really close. For the next few minutes, I found myself running and dodging trees, doing my best to get away, but the sound of my Geiger counter told me that I was meeting little success and I was losing this game. And deep inside, I knew that the entity behind me would eventually catch up and get me. Not that it needed to be next to me to kill me. All it had to do was get close enough and maintain that distance in order to bombard me with more than 1 million sieverts of radiation. Eventually, I knew that I was a goner. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the pain from my arm and exhaustion was getting to me. I was slowing down and the entity behind me was getting closer and closer. I gave up on checking my Geiger counter, but the sound of it shrieking told me that whatever was chasing me was close enough that I was being hit by high doses of radiation. Oddly enough, I didn't feel nauseous or sick from it. Instead, the only pain that I was feeling was from my arm. This, however, did little to ease my fear and sense of dread. Wanting to face my fate directly, I stopped in my tracks and I took in a deep breath. Closing my eyes, I then turned around and confronted my pursuer. When I opened my eyes, I found myself facing a bone-chilling sight. It was a tall, skinny woman whose skin was dried and glowing green. Staring at me with empty, hollow eyes, she gave a smile that nearly made my heart stop. Her cheeks, instead of being covered with skin, was completely exposed, revealing to me her rotten teeth. It looked as if she herself had been the victim of radiation. But I was not able to feel a single ounce of remorse for her, as I was too busy fearing for myself. Standing there in shock, I watched as she moved closer and closer towards me, her green glow almost blinding me from its shine. I wasn't going to run though. I was ready to face it head on. I thought that it might even be a good thing, as it would spare me from suffering in this endless land of trees. As the glowing woman got close, she briefly halted and placed her hand on my chest. Despite my suit, I felt the warmth of her hand on my skin. Looking down, I stared on in horror to see that her touch somehow melted away my suit and my clothing, leaving behind a gap that allowed her to touch my bare chest. Looking back at the glowing woman, she simply kept up that eerie smile, as her hollow eyes stared right into my very soul. It was unsettling, and I found myself having difficulty breathing, but it wasn't from her touch, nor from the radiation that she was emitting. No, it was from the sight of her alone. Eventually, she pulled her hand away from me and turned away. Without doing anything else, she began to move away from me. I watched, completely confused, as she got farther and farther until she was a faint glow in the distance. That glow became less and less while my Geiger counter slowly started to ease the noise that it was emitting. Soon the glow was gone and my instrument was silent. I was alone again. Left baffled by what had just happened, I cautiously lifted my good arm and moved my hand towards my chest. Feeling for any wounds, I was surprised to see that she didn't seem to have left a mark on me. In fact, it didn't seem like any harm came to me, as I didn't feel any sickness from the radiation that I was exposed to. However, these positive thoughts came too soon, as my body suddenly started to shake uncontrollably. Feeling my muscle spasm, I was left helpless as pain suddenly overtook me. Letting out a cry of agony, I found myself constantly shaking while being overpowered with terrible sensations that made it feel like I was being torn apart. Not knowing what was happening and being bombarded by an avalanche of pain, all I could do was scream and cry as I fell onto the forest floor. I couldn't tell how long this went on for, but I know that I continuously begged for it to stop. Yet the pain kept on going and going, growing more and more in intensity. At one point, I thought I was going to go unconscious from what I was suffering, but my body refused to let me go out and I was left there tortured by the entire ordeal. Whatever that woman did to me, it didn't seem like it would end quickly. While I laid there shaking and in agony, I suddenly started feeling bloated. This was followed by a sensation of my limbs becoming swollen. Desperately, I tried to check myself, but to no avail. The pain was just too much and my eyes remained shut as I screamed and shook. The sensation of my body expanding continued on and I felt my splint, suit and clothes rip apart. This was bad and I feared that I was about to explode. It didn't seem like the best way to die, but during that terrible moment, I was willing to take any form of relief, even death. To my dismay, it didn't happen. Instead, I continued to suffer and feel myself seemingly inflating before a sudden snap struck me. It's hard to describe the feeling, but it was as if a part of me had suddenly ripped off. And then just like that, the pain subsided. Although feeling sore, I was relieved that the intense sensations that tormented every part of me had largely stopped. The pain of my broken arm was still prevalent though, especially after it had been aggravated by what had just happened. Despite this, what I was feeling was certainly better than what I had just endured, as it allowed me to think clearly and figure out what had just happened. As I was opening my teary eyes though, I was confronted by a sight that I did not expect. There, laying in front of me and staring at me blankly, was myself. At first, I thought that I was imagining things and was just hallucinating after the pain that I went through. But as I lifted my good arm and moved it in front of me, I felt my hand make contact with the bare skin of the version of me that was staring back at me. It was real and there really was a copy of me right there. It didn't take long for it to dawn on me what had just happened. That was my clone. It was a copy of me that spawned directly from me. I had become just like that tree. At that point, I had no doubt that she did the same thing to the tree after gracing it with her touch. Letting out a curse of anger, I did my best to get up as fast as I could. While the version of me seemingly copied what I did and tried to get up, albeit a little more clumsily. It may have been a copy of me, but it seemed to lack much sentience and fine motor skills. All I could do was copy my actions and do its best to mimic them. In keeping my distance, I stared at my copy with both fear and curiosity. In return, it stared back at me with cold and soulless eyes. For the most part, though, it didn't seem to be in any harm, as it seemed just confused and lost. So what was I to do now? That was the thought that circled my mind as I stood there. Recalling the tree that I encountered earlier, I shuddered at the thought that I would have to go through that process again. If I was cursed by the same thing that it had, then that meant I had 15 minutes before another clone would be forced out of me again. I was not looking forward to that at all. But what could I do to stop it? Nothing. The sad truth was that I was helpless to it. For a moment, I thought of laying back on the ground in despair, knowing that I would have to endure the cycle of torturous pain again when the time comes. I wished that the woman had just killed me. What she gave me was a fate worse than death, and I wondered how long I would have to endure it. If I was lucky, I would die from it. But the fact that I didn't go unconscious throughout the process didn't give me high hopes that I could escape the curse that easily. There was no hope for me. As if to prove this point, I suddenly felt my body shake again. Raising my good arm, I saw it intensely shake again, as my whole body began to spasm. Fear and anger rose up inside of me, as I felt the terrible process start up once again. Helpless at stopping it, all I could do was wonder why it was happening again so soon. The tree had taken 15 minutes before it had replicated itself, but for me, barely 5 minutes since I had a clone torn out of me, and a new one was about to come out. Why was it happening so fast? There was no time for me to answer that question though, as my body shook intensely once more until I felt myself increase in size again. It was painful and terrible. Experiencing it the first time did not prepare me for the second one. Just like before, I agonized and fell to the ground, screaming and shouting. All the while this was happening, the first clone just stood there and stared at me, its expression clueless and blank. I cursed at it as I laid there in pain. I cursed it, the woman, in this whole dimension. And then a familiar feeling of having a part of me splitting off came, and once more the pain began to subside. Sighing in relief, I felt comfort knowing that it had stopped. But then a sense of dread quickly struck me, as I knew that in a few minutes it would repeat, and I would have to do it all over again. Yet even the small brief window of rest was denied from me, as a second later my body began to shake again. Letting out a scream of frustration, I soon cried out in pain as the process started way faster than before. I was so engrossed in panic and fear that I barely noticed the recent clone that came for me. It was only when I was shaking on the ground and looking at the dark night sky that I noticed the clones. In fact, I saw 3 of them. For a moment, I was able to push out the pain as I stared at the 3 sets of eyes looking down at me with blank stares. 2 clones had come out of me. And not only was the process starting faster, but the number of clones was doubling. Did that mean it would become faster and increase in number each time that it happened? As if to answer my question, I felt my body inflate again and stretch my skin. Before long, 3 clones split off from me, rolling on the ground right next to me. Panting in weariness, I barely acknowledged them when the shaking started all over again. All I could do was scream in pain and let the tears roll down my eyes. I was in hell. For the next hour, the process kept going and going, torturing my body and making me experience that insane pain on repeat. No matter how much it happened though, my body somehow endured. I couldn't pass out, I couldn't die. I should have, I wished I could, but it didn't happen. My mind though was faring worse, as I was left trapped in my body that was painfully replicating over and over again. Eventually, I lost track of time and I stopped screaming. All the screaming that I could do was in my head, as I watched more and more of my face stare down at me with empty expressions. If I could bash those faces in, I would, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. As the process continued, the area that I was in started to get crowded by the bodies of my clones. Standing up after they spawned, they would just end up staying in place, not moving until pushed by the new set of clones. Looking around from where I lay, I saw a sea of feet, with the trees no longer visible. If I didn't move, I would end up trapped like that, forced to live in even worse hell than what I was already suffering. Managing to rally what little strength that I had left in me and ignoring the pain as best I could, I willed myself to stand up. It was difficult. The first few times I failed, as clones ripped themselves from me, making it tough to even get on my knees. With great effort though, and timing things just right, I was able to get up on my knees and with my free hand, shakily grab a newly created clone in order to pull myself up. Eventually I was on my feet, using the clone spawning from me as support. Looking around, all I could see was my own face, a sight that I was already sick of. The place was crowded, but there was still enough room to move around. But how long would it be before this whole place was filled with only copies of me? With a new one being ripped from my body every few seconds, I knew that it would all start piling up. I had to get to a better place. I had to get to higher ground. Staring at the closest tree near me, I knew that that would be the ideal place. It would give me some breathing room and get me away from the stupid blank faces that looked at me. And making my way through the crowd of myself, I slowly moved towards my goal. It was a hard and unbearable task, just like getting up from the ground, but through the pain of being forcefully cloned, I managed to get to the base of the nearest tree. Pushing away the clones there, I vented out some of my frustration and anger by shoving them away hard. And then after a new set of my clones had separated from me, I used their bodies to help me up towards the closest branch on top of me. With only one good hand, climbing that tree was difficult, but with the determination that I managed to gather at the time, I knew that I could do almost anything, as long as it meant getting away from myself. Slowly but surely climbing up the tree, each set of clones that split from me ended up falling onto the forest bed below. I had to be careful not to share their fate though, so I made sure to time each movement correctly, being sure to get up the next branch just after the clones split from me. If I failed to do that, the pain of being replicated might make me lose my grip. Falling to the ground wouldn't have been a bad fate if it meant death, but with a sea of clones on the forest floor, I feared I would only end up with more broken bones. If that happens, I would probably end up permanently stuck there and eventually piled on by my own clones. That was a fate that I wanted to avoid as much as possible. So I made my way up carefully, not rushing myself as I got higher and higher. My goal was to reach the top, but with the tree being so high, it was going to take a while to get there. Because of that, I decided to take a break whenever I found a large and sturdy branch. After I was sure that it was secure and wouldn't tip over, I sat there and allowed myself some rest, at least as much rest as I could get from the pain that I was forced to go through. As I sat during those breaks, I looked down below to the mass of clones at the bottom of the tree. In the darkness and from atop the trees, they seemed to have blurred into one blob. Joining them were the new clones that tore off from me, who fell from my skin and tumbled down, hitting various branches before landing atop the pile of replicas below. Following one of those many pauses in my climb, I prepared myself to get up to the next branch when the most recent replication shook me a little harder than the previous one. With my body convulsing, I ended up slipping from the branch. And desperately, I tried to catch myself, but my shaky hand was unable to grab it on time. Time seemed to move slowly during that moment, as I watched myself fall farther and farther away from the branch. Tumbling down, I ended up facing down towards the ground, where other various branches awaited me. If I was lucky, I could perhaps grab or land onto one of them and prevent my continued fall. If not, I would be punctured by each one before I fall into the mass of clones beneath me. However, as I landed on that first branch, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling it slam onto me, I saw my surroundings suddenly change in the blink of an eye. No longer was I looking at the gloomy sight of my clones piling up below me. They were all gone now and were replaced by a forest bed filled with foliage. As I continued to spin and tumble down, I caught glimpses of the forest and saw that it was more diverse and that it was now shrouded in daylight. I wasn't in that terrible dimension anymore. That branch must have had a hidden link towards another dimension. I had escaped. But there was no time to celebrate though. I may have escaped that dimension of horrors, but I have yet to escape from my fall. Slamming from one branch to another, I grunted in pain before seeing the ground zoom towards me. Closing my eyes, I let out a yell before falling out of consciousness. When I briefly woke up, I found myself looking up at a white ceiling. In a dazed state, I looked around to find myself in a large room, with rows upon rows of hospital beds on either side of me. Focusing on these beds, I saw men strapped on each one of them. My vision was blurry, but I swear that I saw that they all had my face. And then as sudden as I woke up, I passed out again from a sudden surge of pain. The next time I came to, I found myself in a smaller room, a much cozier one. Upon waking up, the attendant there quickly fetched a doctor who greeted me with a smile. From him, I learned that I had been in a coma for over a week. For the most part, much of what he said didn't register in my mind, and deep inside I was too busy being overcome by relief, knowing that I had safely returned to my dimension. I had been lucky, extremely so. Turning my attention back to the doctor, I listened as he went on to explain my present condition. As it turned out, when the organization found me, I was still cursed with that uncontrollable replication. However, it seemed that the rate had drastically slowed down from what it was before, as I only spewed out a clone every 2 hours. Whether it was because I was no longer in the dimension that I was cursed in, I don't know. What I did learn, though, was that the organization had somehow cured me. Through an experimental method that apparently involved radiation and some other ancient machinery that they apparently had in their possession, the doctors and scientists managed to reverse my uncontrollable affliction. Hearing that sounded like music to my ears. I no longer had to go through the terrible pain of having myself cloned repeatedly. After the doctor explained everything that he needed to, he told me to get some rest before making his way out of the room. Just as he was walking out, though, I asked him what had happened to the rest of my section. And Jonathan and Catherine were nowhere to be found in the dimension that I entered, while Rachel and Henry never followed me in. I was extremely worried about what befell all 4 of them. The doctor's expression didn't look too positive. "We were never able to recover their bodies," he simply said, and that was enough to tell me what had happened. I spent the next month in observation and recovery. During that time, I learned from friends in other sections of the exploration team that the whole team was being disbanded. Apparently, the organization managed to engineer some kind of organic robot to take our place. This disappointed many in the team, but I didn't care. At least it meant that I no longer had to go back into another foreign dimension ever again. However, there was one more thing they said that concerned me. More of the staircases had been appearing in forests, with each new one materializing farther and farther from the facility. Just like before, they spawned after the machine activated all by itself, which was becoming a frequent occurrence. Given the disaster our section and a few other sections experienced when exploring these wild staircases, the organization was apparently giving up on them. Labeled as too dangerous without any benefits, the organization would instead stick to exploring the controlled ones inside the facility only. The ones that appeared outside would be marked for burning in an attempt to destroy them and to stop people from climbing up them themselves. But still, some seem to slip through the cracks. That means that there are probably many staircases left unattended, free for any hiker or camper to stumble upon. If any of these people decided to play around with them and climb up the stairs, they might just end up in another dimension, one filled with horrors that they were never meant to see and harm that they were never meant to experience. And because of this, I want to give you all a warning. If you find a set of stairs in the middle of the woods, don't go up them. Be careful and burn them instead.